Hello, everyone. Hello, book lovers. Welcome to session 4 of the guided reading of Anne Bronte's Agnes Grey, not Agnes Grey and Bronte. No, we're talking about this novel written by Anne Brontë, one of the three Bronte sisters, and I hope you're enjoying this series of guided reading sessions. I really love the opportunity of reading a book with you guys and discussing it along the way. And I know, it's been a very nice journey for me as well. It's my first contact with Agnes Grey, and I don't know much about Anne Brontë. I know quite a lot about Emily and Charlotte Brontë. Anne Brontë, well, I've read her The Tenant of Whitefell Hall, which is a great novel. We can discuss it at another time. But it's been really interesting and fascinating. That's my favorite word, as you know. It's been really fascinating to know more about Anne Bronte's writing style, to read her novels, and also to know about it's like a window to a trip to the past, right? This book specifically, Agnes Grey, we really get the feeling of what it must have been like to be a governess in mid-19th century England. And to think that a lot of these impressions, a lot of what she writes in Agnes Grey, and a lot of what Charlotte Brontë wrote in The Professor that we read also together in the beginning of this year, they're based on their personal experiences as governesses in Belgium. So I think it's a great opportunity to understand more about this social role, the role of the governess in Victorian England. So let me know in the comments if you're enjoying the sessions. Today, we're going to read chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is called The Parsonage Again, and chapter 7 is called Horton Lodge. But before we do that, as always, let's take a step back and talk about what we discussed last time. So in our last session, we read together and talked about chapters 4 and 5. Chapter 4 is called The Grandmama. And as the title of the chapter suggests, someone comes to visit, and it is the grandmama, so the children's grandmother. And initially, and she is Mr. Bloomfield's mother. And initially, Agnes thought that she was a warm old lady, someone she could connect with. Remember, she was feeling quite lonely, and she had been used to being surrounded by love with her family. And when she arrives at let me just make sure I say the name of the place correctly. Wellwood Mansion. When she arrives at Wellwood Mansion, she immediately identifies this lack of love in Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield's relationship as a couple, in the relationship of parents and children, very different from the situation in her home. So when this, let's say, stranger, this new person arrives, she initially thought, well, this could be someone I could open up with, I could have a nice relationship with, But soon she found out that that the grandma would only treat Agnes well if she flattered her. And the more compliments Agnes gave the grandma, the more amiable the grandma would be to her. But that's not the way Agnes likes to conduct things. She does not like falsehood or flattery or vanity. So eventually, the grandma realized that Agnes would not pay her compliments all the time. So she changed the way she acted with Agnes and became very cold, and even worse, started talking bad things about her to Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield, so to her employers. And what she feels at this point in the narrative is that she keeps losing control of the children. The mother diminishes her authority, the father diminishes her authority, and now the grandma also diminishes her authority. So it's been very hard for her to control these wild children. And chapter 5 is called the uncle. So it is another new character. So if you thought the grandma was bad, the uncle was even worse, right? He is Mrs. Bloomfield's brother and Uncle Robson, and he's a terrible influence on the children. For instance, he encouraged Marianne's vanity and Tom's cruelty and taught the boy how to drink. So the little, the very little um, inspiration, motivation, the little progress she had made, Agnes, with the children, in 5 minutes, the uncle had destroyed completely. Um, and we talked about all the cruelty with animals, how people at the time used to think of animals in a different way from us. So we recognize, most people hopefully recognize animals as living beings, as feeling beings who have needs, physical and emotional. But in the Victorian England, this idea was not yet widespread or accepted. Most people would believe that animals were just creatures um, created for the benefit of humans. So even Mrs. Bloomfield says when Tom wants to play and torture the uh, the little birds, the baby birds, um, she says something to Agnes like, why would you put yourself in the way of a child's entertainment and diversion and fun times?" And Agnes thought it was outrageous that a boy's happiness would come out of the suffering of animals, of these baby birds. And the mother just don't accept it because, in her view, and a lot of people's at the time, um, the humans, in this case, happiness or whatever, would be the human needs would be way above than animals' needs, right? So that's something we discussed last time. So that's an interesting um, um, when we compare past and present, so different counterparts. And in May, Agnes was dismissed by Mrs. Bloomfield, and she felt really disappointed, not because she liked the place, quite the contrary, but because she wanted to prove herself worthy, not to the Bloomfields, but to her family that she left back home. So she wanted to make a difference. She wanted to turn things around, but she was dismissed because Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield believed that the children had only gotten worse since Agnes' arrival. But Agnes is still not ready to let go of this dream of accomplishing something on her own, right? So she believes that not all families will be like like the Bloomfields, and not all children will be like Marianne and Tom and the young one. So she wants to try again, but now with a different family. So last time we finished chapter 5 in this very hopeful tone. And now we'll see what will happen to Agnes if she will find a new adventure and how that will differ from the previous one she experienced at Wellwood Mansion. So let's begin chapter 6, the parsonage again. So that means that she returns home to the parsonage. Grab your copy of Agnes Grey. Also, grab your cup of coffee or tea or pumpkin latte in this beginning of the fall season, and join me in reading Agnes Grey. All right, chapter 6, the parsonage again. For a few months, I remained peaceably at home, in the quiet enjoyment of liberty and rest, and genuine friendship, from all of which I had fasted so long, and in the earnest prosecution of my studies to recover what I had lost during my stay at Wellwood House, and to lay in new stores for future use. So she needs to refill with genuine friendship and love, something she had missed the whole time she was at Wellwood Mansion, and also the prosecution of her studies, so the education. She could not fuel her mind during the time she was there because she had to dedicate pretty much all of her hours to the well-being of children who did not really appreciate her work, right? So now she has the time to um, take time for herself, replenish her energies, um, and to increase her knowledge for future projects. My father's health was still very infirm, but not materially worse than when I last saw him, and I was glad I had it in my power to cheer him by my return and to amuse him with singing his favorite songs. No one triumphed over my failure or said I had better have taken his or her advice and quietly stayed at home. All were glad to have me back again and lavished more kindness than ever upon me to make up for the sufferings I had undergone. But not one would touch a shilling of what I had so cheerfully earned and so carefully saved in the hope of sharing it with them. By dint of pinching here and scraping there, our debts already were newly paid. Mary had had good success with her drawings, but our father had insisted upon her likewise keeping all the produce of her industry to herself. All we could spare from the supply of our humble wardrobe and our little casual expenses, he directed us to put into the savings bank, saying we knew not how soon we might be dependent on that alone for support, for he felt he had not long to be with us, and what would become of our mother and us when he was gone, God only knew. So, what a difference in the family relationships here, right? In family dynamics. So the money that she saved while she was working for the Bloomfields, she really wanted to share with her family. That was the main reason she went there in the first place to work there. But by domestic economy, they managed to pay almost all their debts. So the father told both Agnes and her sister Mary that they should keep their hard-earned money for themselves and to start put them in a savings bank so they could have some financial security if something happened to him. He is feeling unwell. He's sick, so he wants to make sure that the children will have at least a little something to get started to rely on, right? So I think that's really, really nice and sweet and attentive of their father. Dear Papa, if he had troubled himself less about the afflictions that threatened us in case of his death, I am convinced that dreaded event would not have taken place so soon. My mother would never suffer him to ponder the subject if she could help it. So you see, it's an older narrator looking back. So the Agnes that is telling the story has already been through her father's death. But at this point in the narrative, the father is still alive, but not for long. So that's the knowledge that the older narrator already has, but that the Agnes at that time wouldn't know, of course. "Oh, Richard," exclaimed she, the mother, on one occasion, "if you would but dismiss such gloomy subjects from your mind, you would live as long as any of us. At least you would live to see the girls married, and yourself a happy grandfather with a canty old dame for your companion." My mother laughed, and so did my father, but his laugh soon perished in a dreary sigh. "Them married! Poor penniless things," said he. "Who will take them, I wonder?" So their father is also worried that they would not get married because they don't have any money to offer as a dowry. So who would take them for marriage? Marriage was mainly a business transaction, a social contract, right? Um, Love matches were very rare and normally too complicated because of social conventions. So their father is not even considering that outcome. What will sound more like reality to him is if the girls could afford a dowry, but they cannot. So he thinks they will probably not even marry. "Why, nobody shall that isn't thankful for them. Wasn't I penniless when you took me? And you pretended at least to be vastly pleased with your acquisition. But it's no matter whether they get married or not. We can devise 1,000 honest ways of making a livelihood. And I wonder, Richard, you can think of bothering your head about our poverty in case of your death, as if that would be anything compared with the calamity of losing you. An affliction that, you well know, would swallow up all others, and which you ought to do your utmost to preserve us from. And there is nothing like a cheerful mind for keeping the body in health. I know, Alice, it is wrong to keep repining as I do, but I cannot help it. You must bear with me. I won't bear with you if I can alter you, replied my mother, but the hardness of her words was outdone by the earnest affection of her tone and pleasant smile, that made my father smile again, less sadly and less transiently than was his wont. So you see how the mother has a quite forward way of thinking, right? So she says, well, if they don't marry, that doesn't matter. There's plenty of ways we can think of to make honest money. So to make the girls independent, so they wouldn't rely on any male as a husband to support them. That's quite forward thinking. Mamma, said I, as soon as I could find an opportunity of speaking with her alone, my money is but little and cannot last long. If I could increase it, it would lessen papa's anxiety on one subject at least. I cannot draw like Mary, and so the best thing I could do would be to look out for another situation. And so you would actually try again, Agnes? Decidedly, I would. Why, my dear, I should have thought you had had enough of it. I know, said I. Everybody is not like Mr. and Mrs. Bloomfield. Some are worse, interrupted my mother. But not many, I think, replied I, and I'm sure all children are not like theirs, for I and Mary were not. We always did as you bid us, didn't we? Generally, but then I did not spoil you, and you were not perfect angels after all. Mary had a fund of quiet obstinacy, and you were somewhat faulty in regard to temper, but you were very good children on the whole. I know I was sulky sometimes, and I should have been glad to see these children sulky sometimes too, for then I could have understood them. But they never were, for they could not be offended, nor hurt, nor ashamed. They could not be unhappy in any way except when they were in a passion. Well, if they could not, it was not their fault. You cannot expect stone to be as pliable as clay. No, but still, it is very unpleasant to live with such unimpressible, incomprehensible creatures. You cannot love them, and if you could, your love would be utterly thrown away. They could neither return it, nor value, nor understand it. But however, even if I should stumble on such a family again, which is quite unlikely, I have all this experience to begin with, and I should manage better another time. And the end and aim of this preamble is, let me try again. Well, my girl, you are not easily discouraged, I see. I'm glad of that. But let me tell you, you are a good deal paler and thinner than when you first left home, and we cannot have you undermining your health to hoard up money either for yourself or others. Mary tells me I am changed too, and I don't much wonder at it, for I was in a constant state of agitation and anxiety all day long. But next time I am determined to take things coolly. After some further discussion, my mother promised once more to assist me, provided I would wait and be patient, and I left her to broach the matter to my father when and how she deemed it most advisable, never doubting her ability to obtain his consent. Remember the first time she wanted to go? The family was not that supportive because um, they wanted, well, firstly, they wanted her near because they love her. And secondly, because they did not want, well, they did not think she had um, the necessary abilities to teach someone else in the case of a governess, right? And they did not want her to work. Um, they wanted her to have um, a childhood. She's not a child anymore, but they wanted her to keep her safe and in the confines of the home, cherished by the family, without much toil or work or unhappiness or suffering, but she really wants to do it, and she wants to try it again, not only for the sake of um, um, she says hoarding money, right? But not really for the sake of making money to help her and her family, but mainly, I would say, to prove to herself and others that she's capable of achieving great things and of making a difference in someone else's life. I think that is her main motivation. What do you think? Meantime, I searched with great interest the advertising columns of the newspapers and wrote answers to every wanted a governess that appeared at all eligible. But all my letters, as well as the replies, when I got any, were dutifully shown to my mother, and she, to my chagrin, made me reject the situations one after another. These were low people, these were too exacting in their demands, and these too niggardly in their remunerations. Your talents are not such as every poor clergyman's daughter possesses, Agnes, she would say, and you must not throw them away. Remember, you promised to be patient. There is no need of hurry. You have plenty of time before you and may have many chances yet. At length, she advised me to put an advertisement myself in the paper, stating my qualifications, etc. Music, singing, drawing, French, Latin, and German, said she, are no mean assemblage. Many will be glad to have so much in one instructor, and this time you shall try your fortune in a somewhat higher family, in that of some genuine, thoroughbred gentlemen, for such are far more likely to treat you with proper respect and consideration than those purse-proud tradespeople and arrogant upstarts. I have known several among the higher ranks who treated their governesses quite as one of the family, though some, I allow, are as insolent and exacting as anyone else can be, for there are bad and good in all classes. So here her mother is making a social distinction, right? So the Bloomfields were not landed gentry. They were not born in uh, wealthy families, in part of an aristocratic families. They made money through trade. So they were the nouveau riche, the purse-proud tradespeople and arrogant upstarts, as the mother calls them. So they would not have been bred, or they would not have been raised with the same education and etiquette and formal manners as people from the higher classes, the landed gentry, the aristocracy. So now her mother wants her to try again, but now she should be proud of her achievements and her talents, not sell herself for any situation, but aim higher. So to try a fortune with higher family, someone from the landed gentry and aristocracy who would have had the formal education and would know the right manners, how to treat a governess kindly. The advertisement was quickly written and dispatched. Of the two parties who answered it, but one would consent to give me £50, the sum my mother bade me name as the salary I should require. And here I hesitated about engaging myself, as I feared the children would be too old and their parents would require someone more showy or more experienced, if not more accomplished than I. But my mother dissuaded me from declining it on that account. I should do vastly well, she said, if I would only throw aside my diffidence and acquire a little more confidence in myself. I was just to give a plain, true statement of my acquirements and qualifications, and name what stipulations I chose to make, and then await the result. So her mother plays a very good role in her decision, right? Um, and this is, um, I think, very nice to see in a mother really um, encouraging the children to aim higher, to believe in their potential, to believe in themselves. And we're talking about the mid 19th century here, right? So you can definitely see that Mrs. Grey is not a regular woman. Um, she is definitely a good mother, a good wife, good person. Um, and Agnes does not believe herself capable of reaching up to these standards, but with her mother's faith in her, she she gives it a try. The only stipulation I ventured to propose was that I might be allowed 2 months' holidays during the year to visit my friends at midsummer and Christmas. The unknown lady, in her reply, made no objection to this, and stated that, as to my acquirements, she had no doubt I should be able to give satisfaction. But in the engagement of governesses, she considered those things as but subordinate points, as being situated in the neighborhood of O. They don't, the Brontes all have this writing style. They do not write the full name of the place, so only the first letter followed by a dash. And that is, well, either to give the idea that it's a real place and you're protecting the identity of that place, so it gives very similitude to the narrative, but also it gives the vagueness that it could be anywhere, right? So for the person responsible in this house, um, that answered favorably to Agnes's um, advertisement is that, well, education is subordinate to being situated in that neighborhood. She could get masters to supply any deficiencies in that respect, but in her opinion, next to unimputable morality, a mild and cheerful temper and obliging disposition were the most essential requisites. So for that person who's about to hire her, education, knowledge is not as important as morality, a mild and cheerful temper, perhaps another way to say a submissive woman, and obliging disposition. Yes, so being flexible to do what she's being told in a veiled manner. That's what it says, right? My mother did not relish this at all because her mother sees right through it and understands that they are looking for someone to be submissive and obedient. So, yes, my mother did not relish this at all and now made many objections to my accepting the situation, in which my sister warmly supported her. But unwilling to be balked again, I overruled them all, and having first obtained the consent of my father, who had a short time previously been apprised of these transactions, I wrote a most obliging epistle to my unknown correspondent, and finally the bargain was concluded. It was decreed that on the last day of January I was to enter upon my new office as governess in the family of Mr. Murray of Horton Lodge, near O, about 70 miles from our village, a formidable distance to me, as I had never been above 20 miles from home in all the course of my 20 years' sojourn on earth. And as, moreover, every individual in that family and in that neighborhood was utterly unknown to myself and all my acquaintances. But this rendered it only the more piquant to me. I had now, in some measure, got rid of the mauvaise honte that had formerly oppressed me so much, and that is a silly shame, embarrassment, right? So she, after the time working for the Bloomfields, she became, even if a little bit, more confident, and she let go of the shyness she had before. Um, and the fact that it's somewhere distant and with no one that she knows, scary, yes, but also the more piquant, the more interesting to her. There was a pleasing excitement in the idea of entering these unknown regions and making my way alone among its strange inhabitants. I now flattered myself I was going to see something of the world. She was going to break the bubble and see something of the world. That's what she wanted all along, right? To have real experiences. Mr. Murray's residence was near a large town and not in a manufacturing district where the people had nothing to do but to make money. His rank, from what I could gather, appeared to be higher than that of Mr. Bloomfield, And doubtless he was one of those genuine thoroughbred gentry my mother spoke of, who would treat his governess with due consideration and a respectable, well-educated lady, the instructor and guide of his children, and not a mere upper servant. So definitely with the Bloomfields, she was treated as a servant in the house, right? Not, as she puts it, a respectable, well-educated lady who would be the instructor and guide of the children in the house, right? And here there is a footnote I would like to read to you. Number 4. Upper servants included the butler, the housekeeper, and the lady's maid, all of whom were afforded more respect than the lower servants, such as housemaids. Governesses, educated middle-class women, were not of the servant class, and thus were to be treated with even more respect than upper servants. This, however, was not always the case, as we've seen with the Bloomfields. And that social difference is marked by also by language, right? So in a previous chapter, we read a conversation between Agnes and one of the nurses from the nursery who would take care of the babies of the very young children, and how she had a different dialect, more working class, were less educated, of course, given the opportunities that people in that class would have at that time. But governesses would be middle class, higher middle class women with education, so they should be treated differently, but that was not always the case. So now Agnes hopes that she's going to a well-bred family from the gentry who would treat her with the respect that she deserves. Then my pupils, being older, would be more rational, more teachable, and less troublesome than the last. They would be less confined to the schoolroom and not require that constant labor and incessant watching. And finally, bright visions mingled with my hopes, with which the care of children and the mere duties of a governess had little or nothing to do, so that the reader will see I had no claim to be regarded as a martyr to filial piety, going forth to sacrifice peace and liberty for the sole purpose of laying up stores for the comfort and support of my parents. Though certainly the comfort of my father and the future support of my mother had a large share in my calculations, and £50 appeared to me no ordinary sum. I must have decent clothes becoming my station. I must, it seemed, put out my washing and also pay for my 4 annual journeys between Horton Lodge and home. But with strict attention to economy, surely £20 or a little more would cover those expenses, and then there would be 30 for the bank or a little less. What a valuable addition to our stock! Oh, I must struggle to keep this situation, whatever it might be, both for my own honor among my friends and for the solid services I might render them by my continuance there. So she's ready to go, and her visions mingled with hope, right? That had nothing or very little to do with the duties of a governess, right? She really wanted to have a different experience, to see the world. So you see the narrator, the older narrator is looking back here. You see, reader, she talks directly to the reader. I had no claim to be regarded as a martyr to filial piety. So she was not only doing that for the sake of her parents, to help them, to give them comfort, to give them money, but for herself, right? And this is an interesting contextual note. She says, I must have decent clothes becoming my station. So she's going to a house from a higher rank, so she cannot wear the same clothes she wore with Bloomfields. She needs um, new clothes, decent clothes, and she should, it seemed, put out her washing. Now, you may wonder, what does it mean? Let me tell you. So, to put out my washing, send her laundry out to be done for a price rather than having it done for free by the household servants. So she's thinking about um, the um, the things she will have to pay for when she's there. She will have to pay for her journeys back home, so she should have money for that. She should have decent clothes, so she should have money for that. And apparently, because of her new station, she thinks it would not be considered proper to have her clothes washed by the servants in the house, so she would send them out for washing. So that would also cost her. So it would be a lifestyle different from the one she had had with Bloomfields, right? So she's hopeful for the future. This is the end of chapter 6, the parsonage again. And chapter 7 is called Horton Lodge. So it's, of course, clearly the beginning of her new journey to Horton Lodge, farther away from home. She's more confident, she has experience, she's hopeful that things will be different this time. So let's see how it goes. Chapter 7, Horton Lodge. The 31st of January was a wild, tempestuous day. There was a strong north wind with a continual storm of snow drifting on the ground and whirling through the air. My friends would have had me delay my departure, but fearful of prejudicing my employers against me by such want of punctuality at the commencement of my undertaking, I persisted in keeping the appointment. Remember, we've discussed already emotional landscape and how the Brontes really explore that, how the outside world, so the landscape, the weather, they mirror the characters' feelings and also act as a foreshadowing of what is to come. So try to picture this day, the day she leaves for her second employment. 31st of January, so the dead of winter, wild, tempestuous day with a strong north wind, continuous storm of snow drifting on the ground and whirling through the air. It was such a bad storm that the family wanted her to delay her departure, but she didn't. So, based on this description, what do you think her new employment is going to be like? I wonder. I will not inflict upon my readers an account of my leaving home on that dark winter morning. The phone farewells, the long, long journey to O, the solitary waitings in inns for coaches or trains, for there were some railways then, and finally the meeting at O, so the name of the place, with Mr. Murray's servant, who had been sent with the phaeton to drive me from thence to Horton Lodge. The phaeton is a carriage, type of carriage, very modern. Who drives a phaeton is Willoughby in Sensibility, reckless Willoughby. I will just state that the heavy snow had thrown such impediments in the way of both horses and steam engines that it was dark some hours before I reached my journey's end, and that a most bewildering storm came on at last, which made the few miles space between O and Horton Lodge a long and formidable passage. I sat resigned with the cold, sharp snow drifting through my veil, and feeling my lap, seeing nothing, and wondering how the unfortunate horse and driver could make their way even as well as they did. And indeed, it was but a toilsome, creeping style of progression, to say the best of it. A toilsome, creeping style of progression. Think about the physical road from O to Horton Lodge. Think of her own journey, a toilsome, creeping style of progression. At length we paused, and at the call of the driver, someone unlatched and rolled back upon their creaking hinges what appeared to be the park gates. Then we proceeded along a smoother road, whence occasionally I perceived some huge, hoary mass gleaming through the darkness, which I took to be a portion of a snow-clad tree. She couldn't see much. It was dark and everything was covered with snow. After a considerable time, we paused again before the stately portico of a large house with long windows descending to the ground. I rose with some difficulty from under the superincumbent snow drift and alighted from the carriage, expecting a kind and hospitable reception would indemnify me for the toils and hardships of the day. A gentlemanly person in black opened the door and admitted me into a spacious hall lighted by an amber-colored lamp suspended from the ceiling. He led me through this along a passage, and opening the door of a back room, told me that was the schoolroom. So she was brought immediately to the schoolroom. I entered and found two young ladies and two young gentlemen, my future pupils, I supposed. After a formal greeting, the elder girl, who was trifling over a piece of canvas and a basket of German wools, asked if I should like to go upstairs. I replied in the affirmative, of course. Matilda, take a candle and show her her room, said she. Miss Matilda, a strapping hoyden, and hoyden is an old word, it means a boisterous girl, of about 14, with a short frock and trousers, shrugged her shoulders and made a slight grimace, but took a candle and proceeded before me, up the back stairs, a long, steep double flight, and through a long, narrow passage to a small but tolerably comfortable room. She then asked me if I would take some tea or coffee. I was about to answer no. Automatically, no, I don't need anything, right? I was about to answer no, but remembering that I had taken nothing since 7 o'clock that morning, now it's the end of the day. She had taken nothing since 7 o'clock that morning, and feeling faint in consequence, I said I would take a cup of tea. Saying she would tell Brown, the young lady departed, and by the time I had divested myself of my heavy white cloak, shawl, bonnet, etc., a mincing damsel came to say the young ladies desired to know whether I would take my tea up there or in the schoolroom. Under the plea of fatigue, I chose to take it there. She withdrew, and after a while returned again with a small tea tray and placed it on the chest of drawers which served as a dressing table. Having civilly thanked her, I asked what time I should be expected to rise in the morning. The young ladies and gentlemen breakfast at 8:30, ma'am, said she. They rise early, but as they seldom do any lessons before breakfast, I should think it will do if you rise soon after 7. I desired her to be so kind as to call me at 7, and promising to do so, she withdrew. Then, having broken my long fast on a cup of tea and a little thin bread and butter, I sat down beside the small, smouldering fire and amused myself with a hearty fit of crying, after which I said my prayers, and then, feeling considerably relieved, began to prepare for bed. But finding that none of my luggage was brought up, I instituted a search for the bell, and failing to discover any signs of such a convenience in any corner of the room, I took my candle and ventured through the long passage and down the steep stairs on a voyage of discovery. Meeting a well-dressed female on the way, I told her what I wanted, but not without considerable hesitation, as I was not quite sure it was one of the upper servants or Mrs. Murray herself. It happened, however, to be the lady's maid. So she's in her room now, she's by herself, and it is only when she's by myself that she lets go of her facade, right? And she allows herself to feel whatever she's feeling. And she says, she amuses herself with a hearty fit of crying. She's in a new place. She did not receive the warm welcome she had expected. And the room is dark and cold and uh, isolated from the rest of the house. And her luggage was not brought up. So she has to go find them herself. With the air of one conferring an unusual favor, she vouchsafed to undertake the sending up of my things. And when I had re-entered my room and waited and wondered a long time, greatly fearing that she had forgotten or neglected to perform her promise, and doubting whether to keep waiting or go to bed or go down again, my hopes at length were revived by the sound of voices and laughter, accompanied by a tramp of feet along the passage, and presently the luggage was brought in by a rough-looking maid and a man, neither of them very respectful in their demeanour to me. Having shut the door upon their retiring footsteps and unpacked a few of my things, I at length betook myself to rest, gladly enough, for I was weary in body and mind. It was with a strange feeling of desolation, mingled with a strong sense of the novelty of my situation, and a joyless kind of curiosity concerning what was yet unknown, that I awoke the next morning, feeling like one whirled away by enchantment, and suddenly dropped from the clouds into a remote and unknown land, widely and completely isolated from all he had ever seen or known before. You can really feel her isolation, right? Um, and her unhappiness, right? Desolation, novelty, and joyless curiosity. Out of the blue, she's there. She doesn't know anyone. No one cares about her. What is she doing there? She must ask herself. Or like a thistle seed borne on the wind to some strange nook of uncongenial soil where it must lie long enough before it can take root and germinate, extracting nourishment from what appears so alien to its nature, if indeed it ever can. But this gives no proper idea of my feelings at all, and no one that has not lived such a retired, stationary life as mine can possibly imagine what they were, hardly even if he has known what it is to awake some morning and find himself in Port Nelson in New Zealand, with a world of waters between himself and all that knew him. I shall not soon forget the peculiar feeling with which I raised my blind and looked out upon the unknown world. A wide, white wilderness was all that met my gaze, a waste of, and now there's a quote, deserts tossed in snow and heavy laden groves. It's a different, it's a different landscape. She's the farthest from home she's ever been, right? And she quotes, let's see what she quotes from number 4. It's from James Thompson's The Seasons. That's how she makes sense of what she sees with poetry, not most, but quite a lot of times, right? It's a new day. Let's see what it brings her. I descended to the schoolroom with no remarkable eagerness to join my pupils, though not without some feeling of curiosity respecting what a further acquaintance would reveal. One thing, among others of more obvious importance, I determined with myself. I must begin with calling them Miss and Master. It seemed to me a chilling and unnatural piece of punctilio between the children of a family and their instructor and daily companion. And punctilio means kind of exaggerated formality. So with the other family, she just called the children by their first names, but now she wants to do things differently, although she thinks it's quite a weird, strange formality between the pupils and their day-to-day instructor. She does that. Especially where the former were in their early childhood as at Wellwood House. But even there, my calling the little Bloomfields by their simple names had been regarded as an offensive liberty, as their parents had taken care to show me by carefully designating them Master and Miss Bloomfield, etc., in speaking to me. I had been very slow to take the hint, because the whole affair struck me as so very absurd. But now I determined to be wiser and begin at once with as much form and ceremony as any member of the family would be likely to require. And indeed, the children being so much older, there would be less difficulty, though the little words Miss and Master seemed to have a surprising effect in repressing all familiar, open-hearted kindness and extinguishing every gleam of cordiality that might arise between us. So she was afraid that she would create this wall, this barrier between them, if she called them by Master and Miss, Master and Miss, Mrs., the Mrs., Miss and Miss, because it was so formal and so absurd in her mind. But she did not want to commit the same mistake she did before, so this time she was going to be as formal and ceremonial as possible, even though that could mean that it would take longer for the ice to melt between her, the instructor, and the children. As I cannot, like Dogberry, find it in my heart to bestow all my tediousness upon the reader, I will not go on to bore him with a minute detail of all the discoveries and proceedings of this and the following day. No doubt he will be amply satisfied with a slight sketch of the different members of the family and a general view of the first year or two of my sojourn among them. So an overview of the first year or two. So we know that she stayed there for quite long, and she's going to now give a brief description of each one of the members of the family, the children and the adults. And she says, I cannot, like Dogberry, find it in my heart to be tedious to the reader. Now, that is um, an allusion you will need to be familiar with to get, but I will read it for you. Number 5. That's why I always say annotated editions are really important. so you do not miss this instances of intertextuality, for instance. Um, Dogberry, a character in Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing. Dogberry is not only long-winded but also uses malapropisms and incorrect phrasing, which makes him difficult to understand. So she does not want to be like that character who speaks wrong and too long and slow and is, in other words, tedious. She's not going to do that to you, reader, to us readers. She's going to go straight to the point and just give a brief overview of the members of the family. To begin with, the head, Mr. Murray, was by all accounts a blustering, roistering country squire, a devoted fox hunter, a skillful horse jockey and farrier, an active, practical farmer, and a hearty bon vivant. By all accounts, I say, for except on Sundays when he went to church, I never saw him from month to month, unless in crossing the hall or walking the grounds, the figure of a tall, stout gentleman with scarlet cheeks and crimson nose happened to come across me, on which occasions, if he passed near enough to speak, an unceremonious nod, accompanied by "Morning, Miss Grey," or some such brief salutation, was usually vouchsafed. Frequently, indeed, his loud laugh reached me from afar, and oftener still I heard him swearing and blaspheming against the footman, groom, coachman, or some other hapless dependent. Mrs. Murray was a handsome, dashing lady of 40, who certainly required neither rouge nor padding to add to her charms, and whose chief enjoyments were, or seemed to be, in giving or frequenting parties and in dressing at the very top of the fashion. I did not see her till 11 o'clock on the morning after my arrival, when she honored me with a visit, just as my mother might step into the kitchen to see the new servant girl. Yet not so either, for my mother would have seen her immediately after her arrival and not waited till the next day. And moreover, she would have addressed her in a more kind and friendly manner and given her some words of comfort, as well as a plain exposition of her duties. But Mrs. Murray did neither the one nor the other. So here she's comparing Mrs. Murray with her own mother. The way Mrs. Murray welcomed her to the house was even worse or less respectful than the way Agnes's mother would welcome the new servant girl, who was way below Agnes in the social scale. But her mother would have seen her right away and also given her instructions and a warm welcome. And Mrs. Murray did neither, and she also waited almost a full day before she saw Agnes. So, really showing a lack of respect for her, treating her as a servant and not as she had hoped for and expected as a new, almost member of the family. She just stepped into the schoolroom on her return from ordering dinner in the housekeeper's room, bid me good morning, stood for 2 minutes by the fire, said a few words about the weather and the rather rough journey I must have had yesterday. Remember the weather? And she only says, "You must have had a rough journey." Patted her youngest child, a boy of 10, who had just been wiping his mouth and hands on her gown after indulging in some savory morsel from the housekeeper's stores, told me what a sweet good boy he was, and then sailed out, with a self-complacent smile upon her face, thinking, no doubt, that she had done quite enough for the present, and had been delightfully condescending into the bargain. Her children evidently held the same opinion, and I alone thought otherwise. After this, she looked in upon me once or twice during the absence of my pupils, to enlighten me concerning my duties towards them. For the girls, she seemed anxious only to render them as superficially attractive and showily accomplished as they could possibly be made without present trouble or discomfort to themselves. And I was to act accordingly, to study and strive to amuse and oblige, instruct, refine, and polish with the least possible exertion on their part and no exercise of authority on mine. So this is what she expects from the children's education. The girls to learn how to behave, to how to be attractive, and how to show off their accomplishments with the least possible exertion and no authority coming from Miss Agnes Grey. With regard to the two boys, it was much the same, only instead of accomplishments, I was to get the greatest possible quantity of Latin grammar and Valpy's Delectus into their heads in order to fit them for school, the greatest possible quantity at least, without trouble to themselves. John might be a little high-spirited, and Charles might be a little nervous and tedious. So look at the expectations, what she was supposed to do that there. It's not about instructing the children or teaching them morals and how to be good people and how to enjoy feeding the mind and exercising the body. No, it was about teaching the girls how to be marketable for marriage and teaching the boys what they needed to memorize in order to get into school. Here she mentions Valpy's Delectus. Let's see. Many 19th century teachers used the Delectus Scientiarum and Historiarum by Richard Volpe as a textbook. Anne Brontë used her copy to tutor her students at Thorpe Green. So she would be familiar with this book as a textbook because she would have used it herself in her own experience as a governess. So this says a lot about the family, about Mrs. Murray, and about the future of those kids, right? But at all events, Miss Grey, said she, I hope you will keep your temper and be mild and patient throughout, especially with the dear little Charles. He's so extremely nervous and susceptible, and so utterly unaccustomed to anything but the tenderest treatment. You will excuse my naming these things to you, for the fact is, I have hitherto found all the governesses, even the very best of them, faulty in this particular. They wanted that meek and quiet spirit, which St. Matthew, or some of them, says is better than the putting on of apparel. You will know the passage to which I allude, for you are a clergyman's daughter. But I have no doubt you will give satisfaction in this respect as well as the rest. And remember, on all occasions, when any of the young people do anything very improper, if persuasion and gentle remonstrance will not do, let one of the others come and tell me, for I can speak to them more plainly than it would be proper for you to do, and make them as happy as you can, Miss Grey, and I dare say you will do very well. What is expected of her? For her to be submissive, obedient, and to just do what the children say, right? To make them happy. I observed that while Mrs. Murray was so extremely solicitous for the comfort and happiness of her children, and continually talking about it, she never once mentioned mine, my own happiness and my own comfort. Though they were at home, surrounded by friends, and I an alien among strangers, and I did not yet know enough of the world, not to be considerably surprised at this anomaly. Miss Murray, otherwise Rosalie, was about 16 when I came, and decidedly a very pretty girl. She's the oldest. And in 2 years longer, as time more completely developed her form and added grace to her carriage and deportment, she was positively beautiful, and that in no common degree. She was tall and slender, but not thin, perfectly formed, exquisitely fair, but not without a brilliant, healthy bloom. Her hair, which she wore in a profusion of long ringlets, was of a very light brown, strongly inclined to yellow. Her eyes were pale blue, but so clear and bright that few would wish them darker. The rest of her features were small, not quite regular, and not remarkably otherwise, but altogether you could not hesitate to pronounce her a very lovely girl. I wish I could say as much for mind and disposition as I can for her form and face. Yet think not I have any dreadful disclosures to make. She was lively, light-hearted, and could be very agreeable with those who did not cross her will. Towards me, when I first came, she was cold and haughty, then insolent and overbearing. But on a further acquaintance, she gradually laid aside her airs, and in time became as deeply attached to me as it was possible for her to be to one of my character and position. For she seldom lost sight for above half an hour at a time of the fact of my being a hireling and a poor curate's daughter, And yet, upon the whole, I believe she respected me more than she herself was aware of, because I was the only person in the house who steadily professed good principles, habitually spoke the truth, and generally endeavored to make inclination bow to duty. And this I say not, of course, in commendation of myself, but to show the unfortunate state of the family to which my services were for the present devoted. There was no member of it in whom I regretted this sad want of principle so much as Miss Murray herself, not only because she had taken a fancy to me, but because there was so much of what was pleasant and prepossessing in herself, that in spite of her failings, I really liked her, when she did not rouse my indignation or ruffle my temper by too great a display of her faults, which, however, I would fain persuade myself were rather the effect of her education than her disposition. She had never been perfectly taught the distinction between right and wrong. She had, like her brothers and sisters, been suffered from infancy to tyrannize over nurses, governesses, and servants. She had not been taught to moderate her desires, to control her temper or bridle her will, or to sacrifice her own pleasure for the good of others. Her temper being naturally good, she was never violent or morose, but from constant indulgence and habitual scorn of reason, she was often testy and capricious. Her mind had never been cultivated. Her intellect, at best, was somewhat shallow. She possessed considerable vivacity, some quickness of perception, and some talent for music and the acquisition of languages. But till 15, she had troubled herself to acquire nothing. Then the love of display had roused her faculties and induced her to apply herself, but only to the more showy accomplishments. And when I came, it was the same. Everything was neglected but French, German, music, singing, dancing, fancy work, and a little drawing. Such drawing as might produce the greatest show with the smallest labor, and the principal parts of which were generally done by me. For music and singing, besides my occasional instruction, she had the attendance of the best master the country afforded, and in them, as well as in dancing, she certainly attained great proficiency. To music, indeed, she devoted too much of her time, as governess though I was, I frequently told her. But her mother thought that if she liked it, she could not give too much time to the acquisition of so attractive an accomplishment. So first we get to meet Miss Rosalind Murray, 16 years old, the oldest, and how beautiful she is, and how little she knows, how silly she is, how vain she is. She has not cultivated her mind. But then Agnes thinks it's not her fault. It's not because of her disposition, her natural disposition, but because of the way she has been educated or the lack of education so far in her life. Um, so, despite all her faults, Agnes kind of likes her and sees a lot of potential in her. If only she would dedicate her um, strength and her will to perform something good, to learn something that is worth learning. But she only wants to learn things that she can show off and would be considered big accomplishments in the marriage market, right? So, music, singing, dancing, fancy work, drawing, other languages, things that she could show off and then potentially um, get her a good, wealthy husband, right? Of fancy work, I knew nothing. And now, if you're wondering what fancy work is, it means decorative needlework. Not fancy as in imagination, but fancy as in highly decorated needlework. Of fancy work, I knew nothing but what I gathered from my pupil and my own observation. But no sooner was I initiated than she made me useful in 20 different ways. All the tedious parts of her work were shifted onto my shoulders, such as stretching the frames, stitching in the canvas, sorting the wools and silks, putting in the grounds, counting the stitches, rectifying mistakes, and finishing the pieces she was tired of. In other words, all the boring things and the hard things Agnes would do herself. But Rosalie would show it off as the final product as of her own making. And everything was fine. Everything was accepted by the mother. You see the evil in the lack of education. At 16, Miss Murray was something of a romp, yet no, not more so than is natural and allowable for a girl of that age. But at 17, that propensity, like all other things, began to give way to the ruling passion and soon was swallowed up in the all absorbing ambition to attract and dazzle the other sex. But enough of her. Now let us turn to her sister. Miss Matilda Murray, so the second, was a veritable hoyden, remember, boisterous young girl, of whom little need be said. She was about 2 years and a half younger than her sister, so around 13. Her features were larger, her complexion much darker. She might possibly make a handsome woman, but she was far too big boned and awkward ever to be called a pretty girl, and at present she cared little about it. She's 13 years old, she doesn't care about the way she looks. Rosalie knew all her charms and thought them even greater than they were, and valued them more highly than she ought to have done had they been 3 times as great. Matilda thought she was well enough, but cared little about the matter. Still less did she care about the cultivation of her mind and the acquisition of ornamental accomplishments. The manner in which she learned her lessons and practiced her music was calculated to drive any governess to despair. Short and easy as her tasks were, if done at all, they were slurred over at any times and in any way, but generally at the least convenient times and in the way least beneficial to herself and least satisfactory to me. And the short half hour of practicing was horribly strummed through. She, meantime, unsparingly abusing me, either for interrupting her with corrections or for not rectifying her mistakes before they were made, or something equally unreasonable. Once or twice I ventured to remonstrate with her seriously for such irrational conduct, but on each of these occasions I received such apprehensive expostulations from her mother as convinced me that if I wished to keep the situation, I must even let Miss Matilda go on in her own way. When her lessons were over, however, her ill humor was generally over too. While riding her spirited pony or romping with the dogs or her brothers and sister, but especially with her dear brother John, she was as happy as a lark. As an animal, Matilda was all right, full of life, vigor, and activity. As an intelligent being, she was barbarously ignorant, indocile, careless, and irrational, and consequently very distressing to one who had the task of cultivating her understanding, reforming her manners, and aiding her to acquire those ornamental attainments, which, unlike her sister, she despised as much as the rest. Her mother was partly aware of her deficiencies and gave me many a lecture as to how I should try to form her tastes and endeavor to rouse and cherish her dormant vanity, and by insinuating skillful flattery to win her attention to the desired objects, which I would not do, and how I should prepare and smooth the path of learning till she could glide along it without the least exertion to herself, which I could not, for nothing can be taught to any purpose without some little exertion on the part of the learner. And yes, I agree with Agnes 100%. So the mother wanted to smooth the way for all of her children, make it easy. But that's not the way they would learn. And she's not going to accept that. She's not going to smooth the path of learning till they could glide along it without the least exertion. As a moral agent, Matilda, she was reckless, headstrong, violent, and unamenable to reason. One proof of the deplorable state of her mind was that from her father's example she had learned to swear like a trooper. Her mother was greatly shocked at the unladylike trick and wondered how she had picked it up. "But you can soon break her off it, Miss Grey," said she. "It is only a habit, and if you will just gently remind her every time she does so, I am sure she will soon lay it aside." I not only gently reminded her, but I tried to impress upon her how wrong it was, and how distressing to the ears of decent people. But all in vain. I was only answered by a careless laugh and, "Oh, Miss Grey, how shocked you are! I'm so glad." Or, "Well, I can't help it. Papa shouldn't have taught me. I learned it all from him, and maybe a bit from the coachman." because the working class people would have more vulgar language. Her brother John, alias Master Murray, was about 11 when I came, a fine, stout, healthy boy, frank and good natured in the main, and might have been a decent lad had he been properly educated. But now he was as rough as a young bear, boisterous, unruly, unprincipled, untaught, unteachable, at least for a governess under his mother's eye. His masters at school might be able to manage him better, for to school he was sent, greatly to my relief, in the course of a year. In a state, it is true, of scandalous ignorance as to Latin as well as to the more useful though more neglected things. And this, no doubt, and this doubtless would all be laid to the account of his education have been entrusted to an look at this. And all this, so he goes to school with pretty much zero knowledge. And not because Agnes didn't try or didn't have the knowledge to do so, but this doubtless would all be laid to the account of his education having been entrusted to an ignorant female teacher who had presumed to take in hand what she was wholly incompetent to perform. Wow, and this is most likely an echo of Anne Bronte's own opinion, and probably the other girls too. Um, how the children were so unteachable, and their ignorance would be blamed on the governesses when it was not their fault. They had knowledge, but they were not given the authority to teach, and the children had no limits, so they would not learn, and the mothers would only make it worse by wanting the governesses to smooth the path of learning. And in the end, if they did well at if they did not do well at school, or if they were ignorant, years later still, it was the governess's fault. Now think about that. I was not delivered from his brother till full 12 months after, when he also was dispatched in the same state of disgraceful ignorance as the former. Master Charles, the youngest, was his mother's peculiar darling. He was little more than a year younger than John, so around 10, but much smaller, paler, and less active and robust. A pattish, cowardly, capricious, selfish little fellow, only active in doing mischief, and only clever in inventing falsehoods, not simply to hide his faults, but in mere malicious wantonness to bring odium upon others. In fact, Master Charles was a very great nuisance to me. It was a trial of patience to live with him peaceably. To watch over him was worse, and to teach him or pretend to teach him was inconceivable. At 10 years old, he could not read correctly the easiest line in the simplest book. And as, according to his mother's principle, he was to be told every word before he had time to hesitate or examine its orthography, and never even to be informed, as a stimulant to exertion, that other boys were more forward than he, it is not surprising that he made but little progress during the 2 years I had charge of his education. Did you see that? What the mother did? So he had troubles, difficulties reading, and that's the reason, right? Because the mother would not allow the governess allow him to make mistakes. So before he even hesitated, she was supposed to say the right word, and she was not allowed to correct his orthography, nor to say that other boys were ahead of him to motivate him. So he was living a lie. His minute portions of Latin grammar, etc., were to be repeated over to him till he chose to say he knew them, and then he was to be helped to say them. If he made mistakes in his little easy sums in arithmetic, they were to be shown him at once, and the sum done for him, instead of his being left to exercise his faculties in finding them out himself. So that, of course, he took no pains to avoid mistakes, but frequently set down his figures at random without any calculation at all. Yet I did not invariably confine myself to these rules. It was against my conscience to do so, but I seldom ventured to deviate from them in the slightest degree without incurring the wrath of my little pupil, and subsequently of his mamma, to whom he would relate my transgressions, maliciously exaggerated or adorned with embellishments of his own. and often, in consequence, was I on the point of losing or resigning my situation. But for their sakes at home, I smothered my pride and suppressed my indignation and managed to struggle on till my little tormentor was dispatched to school, his father declaring that home education was no good for him. It was plain his mother spoiled him outrageously, and his governess could make no hand of him at all. A few more observations about Horton Lodge and its ongoings, and I have done with dry descriptions for the present. The house was a very respectable one, superior to Mr. Bloomfield's both in age, it was an older family, right? Not new building. In age, size, and magnificence. The garden was not so tastefully laid out, but instead of the smooth-shaven lawn, the young trees guarded by palings, the grove of upstart poplars, and the plantation of firs, there was a wide park stocked with deer and beautified by fine old trees. The surrounding country itself was pleasant, as far as fertile fields, flourishing trees, quiet green lanes, and smiling hedges, with wild flowers scattered along their banks, could make it. But it was depressingly flat to one born and nurtured among the rugged hills of and dash. And we know the moors where the Brontes were raised, where Wuthering Heights takes place, where Jane Eyre takes place. So here, by comparison, it is depressingly flat, no hills to explore. We were situated nearly 2 miles from the village church, and consequently the family carriage was put in requisition every Sunday morning and sometimes oftener. Mr. and Mrs. Murray generally thought it sufficient to show themselves at church once in the course of the day, but frequently the children preferred going a second time to wandering about the grounds all day with nothing to do. If some of my pupils chose to walk and take me with them, it was well for me, for otherwise my position in the carriage was to be crushed into the corner farthest from the open window, and with my back to the horses, a position which invariably made me sick. And if I were not actually obliged to leave the church in the middle of the service, my devotions were disturbed with a feeling of languor and sickliness, and the tormenting fear of its becoming worse. And a depressing headache was generally my companion throughout the day, which would otherwise have been one of welcome rest and wholly calm enjoyment. It's very odd, Miss Grey, that the carriage should always make you sick. It never makes me, remarked Miss Matilda. Nor me either, said her sister, but I dare say it would if I sat where she does. Such a nasty, horrid place, Miss Grey. I wonder how you can bear it. I'm obliged to bear it, since no choice is left me, I might have answered, but in tenderness for their feelings, I only replied, Oh, it is but a short way, and if I am not sick in church, I don't mind it. If I were called upon to give a description of the usual divisions and arrangements of the day, I should find it a very difficult matter. I had all my meals in the schoolroom with my pupils, at such times as suited their fancy. Sometimes they would ring for dinner before it was half cooked. Sometimes they would keep it waiting on the table for above an hour, and then be out of humor because the potatoes were cold and the gravy covered with cakes of solid fat. Sometimes they would have tea at 4. Frequently they would storm at the servants because it was not in precisely at 5, and when these orders were obeyed, by way of encouragement to punctuality, they would keep it on the table till 7 or 8. Their hours of study were managed in much the same way. My judgment or convenience was never once consulted. Sometimes Matilda and John would determine to get all the plaguy business over before breakfast, and send the maid to call me up at 5:30 without any scruple or apology. Sometimes I was told to be ready precisely at 6, and having dressed in a hurry, came down to an empty room, and after waiting a long time in suspense, discovered that they had changed their minds and were still in bed. Or perhaps if it were a fine summer morning, Brown would come to tell me that the young ladies and gentlemen had taken a holiday and were gone out, and then I was kept waiting for breakfast till I was almost ready to faint, they having fortified themselves with something before they went. Can you imagine what a lack of respect, right? So she would suffer all this in silence. Often they would do their lessons in the open air, which I had nothing to say against, except that I frequently caught cold by sitting on the damp grass, or from exposure to the evening dew or some insidious draught, which seemed to have no injurious effect on them. It was quite right that they should be hardy, yet surely they might have been taught some consideration for others who were less so. But I must not blame them for what was, perhaps, my own fault, for I never made any particular objections to sitting where they pleased, foolishly choosing to risk the consequences rather than trouble them for my convenience. So she really should learn to speak up, right? And to make her comfort, her well being also a priority, to make her voice heard. But of course, she doesn't want to lose her position, so she keeps quiet. Their indecorous manner of doing their lessons was quite as remarkable as the caprice displayed in their choice of time and place. While receiving my instructions or repeating what they had learned, they would lounge upon the sofa, lie on the rug, stretch, yawn, talk to each other, or look out of the window, whereas I could not so much as stir the fire or pick up the handkerchief I had dropped without being rebuked for inattention by one of my pupils or told that mamma would not like me to be so careless. I feel so angry for her sake. My goodness, what terrible children. And I wonder, right, about, yeah, the education of children in the 19th century. That's something that interests me quite a lot. Um, I may have said something, but or not, but I have started a postdoctoral research project in which I'm going to look at the ways Shakespeare was taught in the 19th century all the way up to the 20th. But my focus is really on the 19th century. And reading The Professor and Agnes Grey has given me a lot of insights into how education was. So, with The Professor, a lot of repeating and learning by heart and memorizing, right, in the English lessons in Belgium. And here we see the governess trying to teach the children, but by their education at home, they would not consider learning a priority, and they would not treat their instructors, their governesses, their teachers with respect. So that's something that's quite interesting to me. I wonder if you feel the same. Let me know in the comments. Um, the servants, seeing what little estimation the governess was held by both parents and children, regulated their behavior by the same standard. So also the servants, they don't treat her well either, even though she's higher up in the social scale than them. I frequently stood up for them at the risk of some injury to myself against the tyranny and injustice of their young masters and mistresses, and I always endeavored to give them as little trouble as possible. But they entirely neglected my comfort, despised my requests, and slighted my directions. All servants, I am convinced, would not have done so, but domestics in general, being ignorant and little accustomed to reason and reflection, are too easily corrupted by the carelessness and bad example of those above them, and these, I think, were not of the best order to begin with. I sometimes felt myself degraded by the life I had, and ashamed of submitting to so many indignities. And sometimes I thought myself a precious fool for caring so much about them, and feared I must be sadly wanting in Christian humility, or that charity which suffereth long and is kind, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, beareth all things, endureth all things. And here she's quoting Corinthians. So I wonder, right? I would probably feel the same, right? So she sometimes felt she was degrading herself by the life she led, all the knowledge that she had, all the love she had at home. Why would she submit herself to this sort of treatment and to be treated with no respect and her knowledge not appreciated when she could have something better somewhere else? And in others, she feels, oh, what am I doing? This is such a privilege. There are people who have much worse conditions of life, so I should be more humble and more Christian. So that was the dilemma going on in her mind. But with time and patience, matters began to be slightly ameliorated. Slowly, it is true, and almost imperceptibly. But I got rid of my male pupils, There was no trifling advantage, so the boys went to school, and the girls, as I intimated before concerning one of them, became a little less insolent and began to show some symptoms of esteem. Miss Grey was a queer creature. She never flattered and did not praise them half enough, but whenever she did speak favorably of them or anything belonging to them, they could be quite sure her approbation was sincere. She was very obliging, quiet, and peaceable in the main. There were some things that put her out of temper. They did not much care for that, to be sure, but still it was better to keep her in tune, as when she was in a good humor she would talk to them and be very agreeable and amusing sometimes in her way, which was quite different from mamma's, but still very well for a change. She had her own opinions on every subject and kept steadily to them. Very tiresome opinions they often were, as she was always thinking of what was right and what was wrong, and had a strange reverence for matters connected with religion and an unaccountable liking to good people. And it's interesting that these two last paragraphs are written through the perspective of the girls. So they talk about Miss Grey in the third person instead of Miss Grey talking about herself in the first person. So how they changed their treatment. Uh, they didn't really understand Miss Grey. You can see that from these last two paragraphs, right? How she was always talking about what is right and what is wrong, and about religion and about good people, how important it is to be and to be with good people. So they didn't really understand Miss Grey. So slowly they begin to understand each other. So there's a glint of hope here at the end of chapter 7. The boys went to school and she's left at Horton Lodge with the girls, and things seem to be getting better, although she has suffered. It was not as she had predicted, but it was, in fact, just like the weather forecasted in the beginning of her adventure. It was not going to be easy. It was going to be troublesome, toilsome, difficult progress, right? All right, so here we are. This is the end of our session. I hope you've enjoyed reading and discussing chapters 6 and 7. Next time, in our next session, we're going to read chapters 8, which is called The Coming Out, and chapter 9, which is called The Ball. So I will see you then. And don't forget to leave a comment here in the comment section. Tell me, what do you think of the novel so far, and your experience with the guided reading sessions. I wish you a wonderful day and see you next time. Bye.